The machine gun's metallic chatter echoed through the twisted branches of Belleau wood, like the laughter of death itself. Corporal James Henderson pressed his face against the muddy earth, feeling the German bullets whine overhead as they carved through the June morning air of 1918. The acrid smell of cordite and rotting leaves filled his nostrils as he counted the seconds between bursts, calculating his next move with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 3 weeks of hell. "Marines! On my signal! Gunnery!" Sergeant Daniel Daly's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The legendary Marine, already a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, crouched behind a shattered oak tree, his weathered face bearing the marks of countless battles. His eyes, steel gray and unwavering, surveyed the killing field before them, a maze of fallen logs, shell craters, and German machine gun nests that had turned this once peaceful hunting preserve into a nightmare. The 4th Brigade of Marines had arrived at Chateau Thierry in early June, rushed from their training camps to plug a gap in the Allied lines as the German spring offensive threatened to punch through to Paris. What they found was an enemy drunk on victory, confident that one final push would end the Great War in their favor. The Marines, however, had different plans. Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had made that clear just days earlier when a French colonel suggested retreat. "Retreat? Hell, we just got here," Williams had declared, his words becoming legend even as they were spoken. Now, as Henderson watched Daly prepare to lead another assault into the wood, those words seemed to echo from every rifle barrel and bayonet point. The Germans had transformed Belleau wood into a fortress of wire, concrete, and steel. Machine gun positions commanded every clearing, while snipers in the canopy picked off anyone foolish enough to show themselves. The terrain itself seemed to favor the defenders, dense undergrowth that channeled attackers into killing zones, rocky outcroppings that provided natural strong points, and a confusing network of paths that led nowhere except to death. According to contemporary reports from the New York Times, the Marines faced an enemy that had held these positions for months, turning every tree and boulder into a weapon. The German 4th Division had been ordered to hold at all costs, knowing that their success here could mean the difference between victory and defeat in the war's final act. Henderson checked his Springfield rifle one last time, running his thumb over the smooth bolt action that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Around him, his fellow Marines made their own preparations, some writing final letters home, others simply staring into the green hell that awaited them. They were farmers' sons from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college boys from Boston, all united by the eagle, globe, and anchor that adorned their collars. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the full horror of their objective. Belleau wood stretched before them like a medieval vision of purgatory, its canopy so thick that noon looked like twilight beneath the branches. German helmets glinted occasionally in the shadows, reminding the Marines that death waited behind every tree. Daly raised his hand, and the world held its breath. The whistle's shrill cry pierced the morning air, and suddenly the world exploded into motion. Henderson launched himself from the crater's edge, his boots finding purchase on the blood-soaked earth as he charged toward the tree line. Around him, 200 Marines rose as one, their battle cry echoing across no man's land. "Ura, semper fi!" The German machine guns opened fire immediately, their overlapping fields creating a deadly crossfire that swept through the advancing Marines like an invisible scythe. Henderson saw Private Murphy, the kid from Chicago who'd joined up on his 18th birthday, stumble and fall, his rifle flying from his hands. There was no time to stop, no time to help, only the desperate sprint toward cover. Gunnery Sergeant Daly moved like a man possessed, his Tommy gun chattering as he advanced. At 44, he was ancient by infantry standards, but his legs carried him forward with the same determination that had seen him through the Boxer Rebellion in China and the Banana Wars in Haiti. "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" he roared, his voice somehow audible above the din of battle. The first Marines reached the wood's edge and disappeared into the green darkness. Henderson followed, crashing through, the undergrowth with his bayonet fixed, ready for the close-quarters fighting that would decide their fate. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of fallen branches, shell holes, and tripwires that could trigger hidden grenades. Every step was a gamble with death. Somewhere to his left, Henderson heard the distinctive crack of a Springfield rifle, followed by a German scream. Corporal Smith's voice called out, "Sniper down! Watch the trees!" The Marines had learned quickly that the Germans favored elevated positions, using the forest canopy like a three-dimensional battlefield, where death could come from any direction. The fighting in Belleau Wood was unlike anything the Marines had trained for. This wasn't the open warfare they'd expected, nor the trench fighting that had dominated the Western Front for 4 years. This was something primordial, man against man in close quarters, where rifle fire gave way to grenades, bayonets, and sometimes bare hands. Captain John Blanchfield of the 6th Marines had established a command post in a shell crater near the wood's southern edge, trying to coordinate the attack through a maze of severed telephone lines and dead radio operators. The fog of war was literal here, smoke from artillery and small arms fire mixing with the morning mist to create a twilight world where friend and foe were often indistinguishable until it was too late. Henderson found himself part of a small group led by Sergeant Major John Quick, another veteran whose reputation preceded him. Quick had earned his Medal of Honor at Guantanamo Bay during the Spanish-American War, and his calm presence steadied the younger Marines as they pushed deeper into the German positions. "Stay low, move fast, watch your flanks," Quick whispered. As they approached a cluster of machine gun nests, the Germans had positioned their weapons with mathematical precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that made frontal assault nearly suicidal. But the Marines had learned to think like their enemy, to use the forest's confusion to their advantage. The breakthrough came when Private First Class Henry Shearer spotted a gap in the German line, a narrow ravine that had been overlooked by the defenders. Quick immediately recognized the opportunity and led his men through the depression, emerging behind the enemy positions just as the Germans were concentrating their fire on the main Marine assault. What followed was a masterpiece of small unit tactics. The Marines attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, using grenades to clear the bunkers and rifle fire to pin down any Germans who tried to reposition. In less than 10 minutes, they had captured 3 machine gun positions and opened a corridor for the rest of the battalion. But victory came at a terrible cost. Henderson counted at least 30 Marines down in his sector alone, their bodies scattered among the German dead like broken dolls. The forest floor was slick with blood, and the air was thick with the moans of wounded men from both sides. As the sun climbed higher, the Marines consolidated their gains and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. The German counterattack came at dawn on June 7th, preceded by an artillery barrage that turned the captured sections of Belleau Wood into a hellscape of splintered trees and flying metal. Henderson huddled in a shell hole that had become his home for the past 18 hours, listening to the whistle and crash of incoming shells while trying to keep his rifle clean and ready. "Here they come." The warning echoed through the Marine positions as gray uniformed figures emerged from the deeper sections of the wood. The Germans advanced in small groups, using the same infiltration tactics that had served them so well during their spring offensive. These weren't the green recruits the Marines had faced in their first encounters. These were veterans of the 4th Division, men who had survived 3 years of trench warfare and knew every trick of forest fighting. Captain Dwight Smith of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had positioned his men in a defensive line that took advantage of every fallen log and shell crater. The Marines had learned from their initial assault that Belleau Wood rewarded preparation and punished recklessness. Every position was mutually supporting, every rifle had a designated field of fire, and every Marine knew exactly where his nearest comrade was located. The fighting that followed would become the stuff of Marine Corps legend. Sergeant Louis Kukela, a Serbian immigrant who had enlisted to fight for his adopted country, found his position overrun by German stormtroopers. Rather than retreat, he single-handedly counterattacked with his bayonet, killing 4 Germans and capturing 2 machine guns. His actions would earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they inspired the Marines around him to hold their ground against impossible odds. Henderson found himself fighting alongside men whose names would echo through Marine Corps history. There was Corporal Thomas Regan, who had crawled 200 yards under machine gun fire to rescue a wounded comrade, and Private Daniel Daly, not to be confused with the gunnery sergeant, who had held a critical position alone for 6 hours. After all his squadmates had been killed or wounded, the forest itself seemed to be fighting against both sides. Artillery fire had turned ancient oaks into wooden spears that could impale a man as surely as any bayonet. The undergrowth, thick with thorns and hidden obstacles, tore at uniforms and flesh alike. Water was scarce, and what little could be found was often contaminated with gas or simply too dangerous to reach under fire. By midday, the German attack had stalled, but the Marines' position remained precarious. They held perhaps a third of the wood, but their line was irregular and full of gaps that the enemy could exploit. Ammunition was running low, and medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The wounded lay where they had fallen, their cries for help mixing with the constant crack of sniper fire. It was then that Major Lloyd Williams made the decision that would define the battle's outcome. Rather than wait for reinforcements or try to consolidate his precarious gains, he ordered a limited offensive designed to straighten the Marine line and eliminate the most dangerous German positions. It was a calculated risk that could either secure the Marines' foothold in the wood or destroy what remained of his command. According to dispatches filed by war correspondent Floyd Gibbons, who had been wounded while accompanying the Marines, the afternoon assault demonstrated the Corps' unique tactical flexibility. Unlike the rigid doctrine that had dominated Western Front fighting, the Marines adapted their tactics to the terrain and situation, using small unit initiative to overcome superior German positions. The key to the assault was communication. Williams had established a network of runners who could navigate the forest's confusing terrain, carrying orders and intelligence between isolated units. These young Marines, many barely out of their teens, demonstrated courage that amazed even veteran observers as they dashed through machine gun fire to deliver messages that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Henderson volunteered for one such mission, carrying orders from Williams to Captain George Hamilton's company, which had become isolated near the wood's northern edge. The journey was a nightmare of crawling through underbrush, dodging sniper fire, and navigating by compass through terrain that looked identical in every direction. When he finally reached Hamilton's position, Henderson found the company reduced to fewer than 30 effective men, but still holding their ground with grim determination. Hamilton, wounded in the arm but still commanding, listened to Williams's orders with the calm professionalism that characterized Marine leadership throughout the battle. "Tell the Major we'll hold," Hamilton said simply, his words carrying the weight of an unbreakable promise. The morning of June 10th brought news that would electrify the Marine positions. They were no longer alone. The Army's 2nd Division was moving up to support the assault, and fresh Marine reinforcements were arriving hourly. But for the men who had held Belleau Wood for 4 days against constant counterattacks, the promise of relief seemed almost too good to believe. Henderson crouched in his firing position, watching German patrols probe the Marine lines. His uniform was torn and filthy, his face gaunt from lack of sleep and proper food, but his eyes remained alert and his rifle steady. Around him, the surviving Marines of his company presented a similar appearance, haggard but unbroken, tested by fire and tempered into something harder than steel. The arrival of the 7th Machine Gun Battalion changed the tactical situation dramatically. Under the command of Major Edward Cole, these reinforcements brought the heavy firepower that the Marines desperately needed to break the German defensive positions. The new Browning machine guns, with their rapid rate of fire and devastating effect, could suppress entire sections of the German line, while Marine riflemen maneuvered for the killing blow. Gunnery Sergeant Daly, now promoted to acting company commander after his captain had been evacuated with wounds, gathered his men for what he promised would be the final push. "Boys, we've come this far, and we're not backing down now," he told them, his voice hoarse from days of shouting orders over the din of battle. "The Germans think they've got us beat, but they don't know Marines. We're going to show them what Semper Fidelis really means." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the Army units created a diversion on the wood's eastern edge, the Marines would launch a coordinated assault from the south and west, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to outflank the remaining German positions. It was the kind of complex operation that required perfect timing and flawless execution. exactly the sort of challenge that brought out the best in Marine small unit leaders. Private First Class Carl Brannan, who had joined the Corps from his Alcatraz family's farm in Arkansas, found himself leading a squad for the first time after his sergeant had been killed the previous day. At 19, he was responsible for 12 men, all of whom looked to him for the leadership that could mean the difference between life and death. The weight of command sat heavily on his young shoulders, but the Marine Corps had trained him well. The assault began at exactly 1400 hours, marked by a concentrated artillery barrage that walked across the German positions like the footsteps of an angry god. Henderson watched the shells burst among the trees, each explosion sending up geysers of earth and splintered wood. Then the barrage lifted, and the Marines went forward once again. This time, however, the advance was different. The Marines moved, with the confidence of men who knew their business, using every piece of cover and coordinating their movements with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They had learned the lessons that Belleau Wood had taught them, paid for in blood and measured in the lives of their comrades. The German resistance was fierce but increasingly desperate. Cut off from reinforcement and running low on ammunition, the defenders fought with the courage of men who knew they were making their last stand. Machine gun nests that had dominated the battlefield for days were overrun in minutes by Marines who approached from unexpected angles, their bayonets gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Corporal Henderson found himself part of the assault on Hill 242, the dominant terrain feature in the northern section of the wood. The Germans had turned the hilltop into a fortress, with interlocking bunkers and carefully sited observation posts that commanded the entire battlefield. Taking it would require every ounce of skill and courage the Marines possessed. The final assault was led by Captain James Harbord, whose tactical brilliance had been evident throughout the battle. Rather than attack the hill directly, he positioned his men to isolate it from the rest of the German line, then used coordinated fire and movement to systematically eliminate each defensive position. It was a textbook example of small unit tactics, executed by men who had learned their trade in the crucible of combat. As the sun began to set on June 10th, American flags flew from positions throughout Belleau Wood. The cost had been terrible, nearly 2,000 Marine casualties in less than a week of fighting, but the objective had been achieved. The German offensive had been stopped, and the road to Paris remained closed to the Kaiser's armies. The dawn of June 26, 1918, brought an eerie silence to Belleau Wood. After weeks of constant artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and the screams of wounded men, the absence of sound seemed almost supernatural. Henderson stood in what had once been a German command bunker, now draped with American and Marine Corps flags, and tried to comprehend that the nightmare was finally over. The final phase of the battle had been the most brutal yet. The Germans, recognizing that Belleau Wood had become a symbol that transcended its tactical importance, had thrown everything they had into its defense. Elite stormtroopers from the Guard Reserve Division had reinforced the battered 4th Division, bringing with them new tactics and a determination to hold the woods at any cost. Major Thomas Holcomb, who would later become Commandant of the Marine Corps, had coordinated the final assault with the methodical precision that would characterize his entire career. Every Marine unit had a specific objective, every supporting element had defined responsibilities, and every contingency had been planned for. It was modern warfare at its most sophisticated, a far cry from the desperate charges that had marked the battle's opening days. The breakthrough had come when 2nd Lieutenant Clifton Cates, wounded 6 times but still commanding his company, had identified a weakness in the German line near the wood's northwestern edge. His men, reduced to fewer than 20 effectives, had infiltrated through a drainage ditch and emerged behind the main German positions, just as the coordinated Marine assault began from the opposite direction. What followed was less a battle than a systematic dismantling of German resistance. The defenders, caught between converging Marine attacks and cut off from their supply lines, fought with desperate courage, but could not overcome the tactical disadvantage. Position after position fell to Marine rifle fire, grenades, and bayonets, until only isolated pockets of resistance remained. Henderson had been part of the final assault on the last German stronghold, a concrete bunker complex that had anchored the enemy line for nearly 3 weeks. The position was taken by Sergeant Major John Quick and a hand-picked team of volunteers who approached through a communication trench that the Germans had thought was impassable. Their sudden appearance in the bunker system's rear created panic among the defenders, who surrendered after a brief but vicious firefight. The human cost of victory was staggering. The 5th Marines had lost over 60% of their strength, while the 6th Marines had suffered nearly as heavily. Every company had been reduced to the size of a platoon, every platoon to the size of a squad. The survivors bore wounds, both visible and invisible, bullet scars, shrapnel fragments, and the 1,000-yard stare that marked men who had seen too much death in too short a time. But they had also earned something that would last forever. The German 4th Division's official history, captured after the war, contained a passage that would become legendary in Marine Corps annals. The Americans who opposed us were a new type of soldier, fresh, clean, and full of fight. We called them Teufelhunden, devil dogs, for their fighting ability and tenacious spirit. Captain Lloyd Williams, who had uttered the immortal words, "Retreat, hell, we just got here," would not live to see the battle's end. He fell on June 11th, leading his men in yet another assault on German positions. His death was mourned throughout the Corps, but his spirit lived on in every Marine who had served under his command. The French government, in recognition of the Marines' sacrifice, officially renamed Belleau Wood as Bois de la Brigade de Marine, Wood of the Marine Brigade. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, issued a statement declaring that the deadliest weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle. These were not mere words of praise, but acknowledgments of a fundamental change in military history. As Henderson walked through the shattered forest, now eerily quiet, except for the moans of wounded Germans being treated by Marine corpsmen, he reflected on what had been accomplished. They had not merely won a battle or captured a piece of terrain. They had forged the modern Marine Corps in fire and blood, creating a legacy that would inspire future generations of Marines for decades to come. The wood itself bore the scars of the struggle. Ancient trees, some over a century old, had been reduced to splintered stumps. The forest floor was carpeted with shell casings, discarded equipment, and the detritus of modern warfare. It would take years for nature to reclaim this battlefield, but the memory of what had happened here would endure forever. The hospital ship traversed the Atlantic's gray waters with precious cargo, the wounded warriors of Belleau Wood, finally, heading home after months of recovery in French field hospitals. Henderson stood at the rail, his left arm still in a sling from the German grenade that had nearly ended his war on the battle's final day. The salt spray reminded him of simpler times, before he had learned that courage could be measured in yards gained under machine gun fire. In the months following the battle, the world had begun to understand what had happened in that twisted forest. War correspondent Floyd Gibbons, despite his own wounds received while covering the Marines, had filed dispatches that electrified the American public. His stories of Marine heroism under impossible odds had captured the nation's imagination and established Belleau Wood as a symbol of American determination in the face of adversity. The statistics told only part of the story. In 26 days of fighting, the Marines had suffered 9,177 casualties, more than half their total strength. But they had also accomplished something that military historians would debate for generations. They had stopped the German offensive cold and demonstrated that American forces could not only match, but exceed the fighting ability of Europe's veteran armies. Back home, the victory had transformed public perception of the Marine Corps. Before Belleau Wood, Marines were known primarily for their service in small colonial wars and their role as ship's guards. After Belleau Wood, they were recognized as America's elite shock troops, the men who could be counted on to hold the line when all seemed lost. Recruiting stations across the nation reported unprecedented interest from young men who wanted to earn the title that had been forged in the French forest. The battle's impact extended far beyond American shores. German military commanders, analyzing their defeat, recognized that they had encountered a new type of soldier, one who combined individual initiative with unit cohesion in ways that their own doctrine had not anticipated. The Marines' ability to adapt their tactics to the terrain and situation, rather than rigidly following predetermined plans, would influence military thinking for decades to come. Henderson thought about his fallen comrades as the ship cut through the swells. Men like Gunnery Sergeant Daly, who had survived the battle only to die in the influenza pandemic that swept the world in late 1918. His final words, spoken to a young Marine in a Paris hospital, had been typically direct. "The Corps will go on. Make sure you're worthy of what we paid for it." The survivors carried more than physical wounds. Many would struggle for years with what doctors then called shell shock, but would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The nightmares would fade with time, but the memories would remain vivid. The smell of cordite and death, the sound of machine guns chattering through the trees, the weight of responsibility for men who had trusted their leaders with their lives. Yet they also carried something else, the knowledge that they had been tested in the ultimate crucible and had not been found wanting. They had faced an enemy that had dominated European battlefields for 4 years and had emerged victorious through their own skill, courage, and determination. That knowledge would sustain them through the long years of peace that followed, serving as a reminder of what Americans could accomplish when they stood together. The Marine Corps itself had been transformed by the experience. The lessons learned in Belleau Wood, the importance of small unit leadership, the value of tactical flexibility, the power of esprit de corps, would become fundamental elements of Marine doctrine. Future battles in the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond would validate the principles that had been written in blood among the trees of a French hunting preserve. As the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon, Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of wood, a fragment from one of the oak trees that had sheltered him during the battle's worst moments. He had carried it through his recovery, through the long voyage home, and would carry it for the rest of his life. It was his personal reminder of Belleau Wood, where boys had become men and men had become Marines. The ship's whistle sounded as they entered New York Harbor, and Henderson smiled for the first time in months. He was home, scarred but whole, carrying the legacy of those who had not returned. Somewhere in the distance, he could almost hear Gunnery Sergeant Daly's voice one last time. Once a Marine, always a Marine. The Battle of Belleau Wood was over, but its legend had just begun.